maybe a couple months ago, I had done a video at the request of one of my followers, Kim, um, about the SAVE Act, which is about, voter suppression essentially. But, it's the GOP bill that they're trying to pass, and it's actually still going through Congress to require people to present a passport or birth certificate plus other documents every time that they register to vote. Not every time you vote, every time you register to vote. And have to do that every time that you move, or, if say you miss an election and you get purged from the voter rolls, having to go in person and present a passport or birth certificate plus some other documents. Um, and the outcome of this was going to be essentially that a bunch of married women who've changed their names would lose their access to vote. It was tens of millions. I think it was the Brennan Center had estimated something like 9% of American voters were unable to produce the requisite documents easily in order to prove their citizenship and be able to vote. And it was essentially going to disenfranchise tens of millions of voters. That, like I said, is still going through Congress, still a very big concern. But Donald Trump last week signed an executive order that essentially would implement the SAVE Act just by executive fiat. Now, I want to be clear, Donald Trump doesn't have the right to do that. Executive orders are not law. Executive orders are just direction to federal agencies, essentially laying out how the president is interpreting existing law. And each branch of each branch of the federal government has its own rights to interpret federal law. And there's a acceptable way to use executive orders and an unacceptable way to use executive orders. And Donald Trump is a big fan of the unacceptable ways of using executive orders. He tends to think he can just write new law by signing executive orders, and he cannot do that. The only reason why he's getting away with so much of it is because Congress has laid down, spread its legs, and just said, "Yeah, go ahead, take all of our prerogatives and powers away from us," because it's controlled by the Republicans. Anyway, but he essentially signed a executive order last week that would, if it was allowed to stand, implement the SAVE Act without any new legislation being passed. It would implement the SAVE Act and then some, because it really goes beyond and takes a ton of power from the states and centralizes them at the federal government. And this is something that Republicans and conservatives have been against for a very long time, because, states' rights and all that sort of stuff. But for people on the left have been generally against it as well, because the elections in the United States are run all around the country. There's no centralized authority for running elections, and it's one of the ways that the United States election system is so difficult to rig, to hack, to, essentially to game, because it's run at multiple states and multiple counties and jurisdictions throughout the country. There's no centralized election authority. This would change that, and it would require states to recertify all of their electric voting machines or electronic voting machines, and it would make a lot of them unusable. And many states have trigger laws that, like, if the ballot counting machines don't meet federal approval, then they're automatically not allowed to be used. And this would make it so that many ballot counting machines do not meet federal guidelines, which would result in states having to do hand counts, which are way less accurate. And if you might remember from the election, Donald Trump had talked a lot about, like, if you don't have all your votes counted by election night, the counting should stop at election night. And so what it really sets things up for is a lot of states not counting votes and a lot of chaos just in general around the elections. And this is what's, I think, important, because ostensibly these laws will impact both people on the left and people on the right. The SAVE Act, as I talked about in that bill, has potential to really impact rural voters and married women and a bunch of, constituencies that often go for Donald Trump. So you could think to yourself, like, God, why would you pass that bill? Because it's going to hurt your own voters. I don't think that the goal isn't necessarily to suppress liberal votes, or I should say, it's not exclusively to suppress liberal votes. The idea is to create chaos. And then when there's chaos, to say, okay, well, we have to, this election's on pause, or this election's thrown out, and we're just going to have to maintain the status quo. And that all sounds crazy. It sounds, fucking tinfoil hat crackpot. But nothing is tinfoil hat crackpot these days, you guys. And everything that we've seen from this president just in the last, 100 days, is a wild escalation of anything that you could expect. And a lot of it's stuff that people have predicted for the last couple of years, and that everyone's been like, that's insane, that's crazy, they would never do that. And it just kind of keeps happening and happening. So at some point you have to get that inclination out of your head to be like, that would never happen. All of it could happen, no matter what it is, it could happen. So between Donald Trump saying very seriously that he is going to seek a third term, and he thinks that he can seek a third term, and then him signing these bills to, actually I left this out. The executive order, on top of all those other things, the executive order will withhold funds from states that don't implement the details of that executive order. So it's really, it's got some, which again is illegal, but it attempts to have some teeth in forcing states to change their election laws to comply with Donald Trump's preferences. And again, this is all, I think, to create chaos, and for him to step in and say, well, they didn't follow this, they didn't follow that, we're invalidating this, we're invalidating that. Congress isn't going to certify these elections. So I think a couple things. One, if you're waiting for the 2026 elections to, sweep the Democrats into power and have it be a check on Donald Trump, I wouldn't think that that's going to happen. I would not anticipate a free and fair election in 2026. I would definitely not anticipate a free and fair election in 2028. And then on top of that, like I said, if you're one of these people who's like expecting some system to step into place to stop Donald Trump, it will not happen. The only bulwark, the only protection that we have as a people against this administration and against the Republican Party is ourselves. And so organizing and acting accordingly, I'll just put it that way, is necessary. Nothing is going to protect our rights beyond us. This is another great example of it. So I just want to repeat that one more time. If you are waiting for some institution, whether that's a Democratic Party, whether that's the judiciary, if you're waiting for some sort of event, some sort of red line, none of those things are going to happen, you guys. If so many of these things that he's done now had happened in his first administration, we may not even be in this situation now. But it's been the incremental, buildup of all this, and it's just going to keep going that way. And the more people on the right and the more institutional Republicans that are dragged along with Trump on this excursion into fucking authoritarianism and fascism, the less likely those people are to break with him. It's really this, like I've talked about before, this idea that they have nothing without him, and they realize that. And also they realize that if the left is able to sweep into power, the jig is up, and they will do everything in their power to stop that from happening. So there's going to be an awful lot of, hey, maybe I don't really support what Donald Trump is doing, but we can't possibly let the left take over. So we're just going to have to, bite the bullet and deal with the election being called off, or what is some very brazen other anti-democratic action. So don't wait for somebody else. Just keep that in mind. There will be no savior on any of this sort of stuff. We're in the people need to protect themselves moment of this administration, and frankly, we have been for quite some time. So if you haven't already, arm yourselves.